So I want to welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Jill Rockmeisel. I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry. And I want to welcome everyone in the department, faculty, trainees, and individuals from outside our department for joining us for our final grand rounds of the FY22 season. We will not be having grand rounds in 2 weeks because of our graduations, residency graduations. So I'm delighted for everyone to join. Want to just remind you all to please keep yourself muted. We will put your questions as you think of them in the chat, and we will take questions at the end in the order that they come in. So that would be most helpful. I'm excited to introduce our esteemed guest speaker for our final grand rounds, who is a colleague from across the city from Hopkins. Today we have with us Dr. Matthew Johnson. He is the Susan Hill Ward Endowed Professor of Psychedelics and Consciousness Research at Johns Hopkins, working with psychedelics since 2004. He is one of the world's most widely published experts on psychedelics. He's published research on psychedelics and mystical experience, personality change, tobacco smoking cessation, cancer distress treatment, and depression treatment. In 2021, he received as principal investigator the first grant in 50 years from the US government for the treatment study with a classic psychedelic, specifically psilocybin, in the treatment of tobacco addiction. He's also known for his expertise in behavioral economics, addiction, sexual risk behavior, and research with a wide variety of drug classes. He's been interviewed by Anderson Cooper in 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, NPR, Fox, BBC, and in the Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. So fascinating, rapid developing career here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson as he addresses us with psychedelics, paradigm shifting treatments in psychiatry. Dr. Johnson.
Thanks for the warm introduction, Jill, and yeah, appreciate everyone taking the time to take a listen. Yeah, I'm gonna chat about a good amount of work that I've done with psychedelics. Certainly not all of it, but kind of going to hit the clinical highlights, and probably with the most focus on this area, as been mentioned, of smoking cessation, and try to get into some use as an opportunity to prompt some of the transdiagnostic questions, like what's happening with the treatment of these various disorders that might be sensitive to this pharmacological treatment. But yeah, I think hopefully it'll be an opportunity for some good discussion after I show you some of this work. So let me see if I can go ahead and get the screen sharing going. One moment. Okay. Things froze up for me for 2 seconds, which shot my heart rate up a little bit, but seems like we're in the flow again. Let's see, hopefully.
You're good, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. That was your mind reader. Years of the pandemic and everyone knows the drill. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, you could put it in presentation mode if you'd like.
Oh, actually, so that's interesting because I am
at the bottom of your slide deck in the right-hand corner. There's, yeah, right there.
Right, which I've done, and one monitor has it. I think the solution to this is to unplug my external monitors to force it, because I do have it on presentation mode, but apparently the screen focuses on the other one.
Oops.
Let's see if we can. Okay, does this look like a full screen?
There you go. You got it.
Okay, we're in business now. Okay, thank you. Okay. And with that, I already have my introduction made, so we'll move on. Just went by way of disclosure, just want to show you, I've the last couple years have advised some companies doing work with either psychedelics or related compounds, analogs. None of the work I'm going to show you today is about the work by these companies or any of their particular drug products, but nonetheless, just that general relationship to psychedelics. So what I'm going to be telling you about is the compound psilocybin. A lot of folks have probably heard of it. If not, you may have heard of magic mushrooms. That psilocybin is the primary active constituent. It's actually a prodrug for a drug called psilocybin that works its way to the CNS. But the primary agent or prodrug in a variety of mushrooms, often called magic mushrooms, but they actually span over 200 species by our current count of mushrooms. Most of what we're familiar with in the United States on the illicit market would be psilocybe, the psilocybe genus of mushrooms, Psilocybe cubensis, and others. Those are popular. They grow out of cow patties, and they're fairly easy to grow for folks at home. So those tend to be the ones that show up on the illicit market. Pharmacologically, it's important to understand that psilocybin is a classic psychedelic. And by that, I mean that its primary mechanism of activity is at the serotonin 2A receptor. It serves as an agonist or partial agonist. All at that receptor, all of these classic psychedelics share that primary mechanism of action, which seems critical for having these, generally the psychedelic effects. Now, the nomenclature is important here, and not even all the scientists agree on what the right nomenclature is. Most folks will consider other compounds outside of classic psychedelics to be, more broadly speaking, psychedelic, such as MDMA, ibogaine, ketamine. So you have MDMA being a serotonin and other monoamine releaser. You have ketamine and other drugs like PCP being NMDA antagonists, glutamate system. Ibogaine has a really complex pharmacology involving a lot of the above. So these, I think it's appropriate. We can call them psychedelic, and based on this general idea that they, at a very basic level, have a very profound effect on a person's very conception of reality, conception of themselves, but mediated through very distinct mechanism. And so therefore the risk-benefit profile, as one would expect when we're talking about the pharmacologically specific classic psychedelics, there's far more commonality there amongst their effects and their risk-benefit profile compared to some of these other compounds. So most of what I'm going to say about psilocybin is likely true for these other classic psychedelic compounds. For example, like comparing one benzodiazepine to the other, more so variations on the same theme. But the other classic psychedelics folks might be familiar with are LSD. Folks probably heard of that. Mescaline, which shows up in a number of cacti, and dimethyltryptamine or DMT. And you may have, if you haven't heard of that, you may have heard of the South American sacramental concoction known as ayahuasca. There's actually several syncretic and indigenous religions that use this. There's, in the United States, Supreme Court protected use of ayahuasca by a certain, at least one religion, the Unión de Vegetal, similar to earlier protection of peyote use by the Native American church. So those are the classic psychedelics. And I mentioned 2A being the key mechanism of action. We really know that, even though all of these drugs have other sites of action that provide sort of a coloring around those effects. We're very confident that 2A, is a necessary mechanism of action for the psychedelic effects. We know this drug class produces robust discriminative stimulus properties. So animals such as rats can be trained to reliably discriminate, for example, LSD from a placebo or saline injection. And you could do lots of stuff with that. So for example, throw in an antagonist before administration and you see the 2A receptor and you see a blockade of the ability of non-humans to discriminate the psychedelic effects anymore under those models, consistent with work in humans. And here, the Vollenweider lab in Switzerland, blocking 2A under double-blind conditions in humans, they don't feel the psychedelic effects. So that's all consistent. And then really the earliest evidence really pinpointing 2A as the really very highly suggestive as the key site of action is just this correlation published by Richard Glennon in the early 80s. I'm showing you here. So plotting on the X, the hallucinogenic dose, the minimal hallucinogenic dose, so it's the minimal number of milligrams needed to achieve a psychedelic effect in people. Plotted on the Y, the affinity or the stickiness for the 2A receptor across a variety of compounds, and you just see this remarkably, and it's a log correlation I'm showing you, but remarkably tight correlation, certainly very consistent with it playing that key mechanism of action. So one of the really interesting things, fascinating things about this whole area is it just intersects so many domains, not just pharmacology and chemistry and clinical science and the understanding and treatment of psychiatric disorders, but our social history and in our modern society, the role these drugs have played certainly since the 60s. But then going even further back, it's fascinating. Not only historical, but truly prehistorical, apparently in their use. So I'm showing you examples in the middle and the center of artifacts from Mesoamerica and Central America suggesting use of psilocybin mushrooms sacramentally dating back hundreds of years ago and even a few thousand years ago. But on the right, I'm showing you a photo of the most ancient suggestive evidence. This comes from a cave painting in northern Africa, so Algeria, dated back to an estimated 9,000 years ago. So this is like several thousand years before the first human civilizations that we know of popped up in Mesopotamia. So that's the ancient part. And if you can't see it, I'd say it is arguable. I think highly suggestive, but a bunch of these little figures, their heads are in the shape of giant mushroom caps. Their hands are filled with mushrooms and they're sort of dancing around. I can't help but to think they kind of look like those Grateful Dead bears, like dancing in a little chain together. So we can speculate, again, not definitive, but if true, and apparently the environmental science suggests that although they wouldn't grow in the environment today, it's too dry, that they would have grown in that area in the ecosystem that was prevailing 9,000 years ago. So fast forwarding a number of millennia to closer to the modern era, we come to what I'd call the first heyday of clinical research with these classic psychedelics, prompted by the synthesis and then later discovery of the psychoactive effects of LSD by Albert Hoffman, working for a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland in the late 30s and then the early 40s is when he discovered the psychoactive effects. But that, even though mescaline had been its psychoactive properties and its isolation went back to the turn of the previous century, it was really that synthesis of LSD that really kickstarted thing. And there was so much fascination about the incredible potency. In other words, the fact that you could take 1/10 of a milligram of this stuff and have these profound effects on conscious experience was really intriguing to folks. I mean, this is right when psychiatry was moving from a predominantly psychodynamic model to more of a modern neuroscientific understanding. Just the idea that the brain was an electrochemical messaging system, that was a new thing. Neurotransmission, these were, the understanding of it was a new thing. So LSD came about at a really interesting time. There were thoughts that maybe it was a modeling some endogenous ligand that was at play in psychotic disorders, something that didn't turn out to be true, but nonetheless really spawned a lot of, I think, important investigative work, both modeling and then modeling disorders like schizophrenia and then moving in later in terms of the treatment of disorders. The most promising treatment of disorders were, and I'll show you a bit of the continuation of these general domains, but working with terminal cancer patients who really had this existential distress about their death, involving both depressive and anxiety symptoms, and then the treatment of addiction in the form of alcoholism, or as we call it today, alcohol use disorder. Now, this, some of this early therapeutic work was actually prompted, for example, by in the treatment of alcoholism, the earliest ideas by some researchers at University of Saskatchewan that is that, oh, sometimes people clean up after they get the delirium tremens because it's such a rock bottom experience. But a good number of people can actually die during that process. So is there a safer way to mimic the DTs? And that's where LSD came in. So this idea of I was going to model these psychotic type, not to go for a euphoric or a transcendental of any of this stuff came later, but to model that more of this sort of psychotic, this highly dysphoric DT-like reaction. But nonetheless, what they ended up seeing, probably because it was a really gifted group of, I think, clinical investigators like Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer. And if you go back watching old video of these folks, they're just kind of delightful, interesting people. And I think under that context, they tended, what they saw to their surprise actually were these, you can use many different names, wasn't typical in the realm of pharmacology, but transcendental, mystical, these just highly positive experiences that people had a lot of interesting things to say about and tended to find useful in terms of their dealing with these psychiatric disorders. So after that early period, and really as we got into the late 60s and early 70s, the research really came to a halt despite some promising early findings in those domains. Now, to be clear, there was some wacky research. There was some research that was not done safely. There was some highly unethical research. The CIA was, and it's not, in an urban legend, this has all been put out there under the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, a great book called by Lee and Schlein called Acid Dreams, based on those FOIA revealed documents. I mean, the CIA was dosing American citizens, unbeknownst to their knowledge, on these compounds to investigate their effects, investigating them as interrogation agents, this type of thing. So this was a wild landscape filled with all. Now, however, if you sift through all of that complexity, and there were certainly limitations in the clinical work that was done, but there was a signal that this was worthy of follow-up. But unfortunately, there was a decades-long dormancy. And it wasn't that, and I really first discovered this in doing a report on this stuff as an undergraduate, which kind of sparked my long-term interest in doing work with these compounds. It wasn't that there was really this kind of rational, sober conclusion that that psychedelics had no potential future as mental health treatment, or that they were so inherently dangerous they could never be used. But that certainly became the message, largely because of a couple of things. One, LSD became really popular on the street as we moved from the mid to the late 60s and early 70s. Average dose on the street was 6 times what it is today. Today, on average, about 50 micrograms for LSD. Back in the day, the average dose was 300. And if you really want to get the appreciation, some of the harms that can happen, talk to some docs that were in the emergency departments back in the late 60s, and they will tell you, and that happens today, but it was just at a frequency, particularly at a higher dose in those days, that it's humbling. And so there were some very real casualties of vulnerable people that shouldn't have been exposed. And, as you would imagine, young people taking it under the least safe conditions at, sometimes, as you could imagine, with sort of, young people leading each other, and, certainly in the risk benefit, the truly unfortunate, that was unfortunate, but in terms of the consequences for the research, really unfortunate that sensationalism by the media really failed to distinguish this risk benefit profile of young people taking very high doses of these compounds on their own versus the model. Even at the time, if you sifted through the research, you could see what's the risk benefit profile under appropriate conditions where we've done our best to mitigate the known risks of these compounds. So really that's sensationalism. And it went from the mid 60s. It was hard to get a negative story published about LSD in the early to mid 60s. And then that just turned on its head in a few years. And really the research, and unfortunately, LSD became associated with all of the broader changes in society, the global youth movement, anti-Vietnam War protests. So unfortunately, the research was really sacrificed. So that, if those were the dark ages, we're now perhaps in the age of enlightenment, or it's been called a psychedelic research renaissance. But as evidence of that, I'm showing you just PubMed hits the number of scientific papers published per year. This is with, you can look at this in a number of ways, but this is with number of hits with psychedelic or hallucinogen, essentially a synonym in the title of the paper. And you see that was a kind of a steady baseline back to the 80s, 5, 10, 20 papers a year bouncing around. And then around 2004, at the time I was lucky to jump into doing work in this area. I mean, one of the reasons that I was lucky is that that's sort of towards the beginning of this, what appears to be this exponential like uptick in research interest. Now, certainly a lot of this is mechanistic, a lot of this is in non-humans, but I would say it's a fairly solid conclusion that the large majority of this interest has been prompted by some of the really promising clinical findings in humans, some of which I'm going to share with you today. There we go. I don't like to give any talk in this area without at least mentioning the harms briefly. So these are very, very powerful psychoactive agents, and there are absolutely risks. Don't have time to go into details, but I'll tell you, I've made it a focus of my career from the very beginning, starting this a paper in 2008 where I synthesized everything going back to the earliest days of psychedelic research. What do we know about the risks of these classic psychedelics, and what can we do? What do we know in the literature, the mitigation strategies, how to do this safely? And it's been great to learn that, I've heard from multiple folks at the FDA, there's an intense interest at the FDA in understanding these compounds because they're getting so many applications, but they've used, thankfully, our paper to evaluate novel protocols. I and colleagues have been told. Colleagues and I were invited recently to, back in January, an NIH-wide workshop to try to understand these compounds. What are even the right questions we should be asking, the FDA is saying. And so part of my efforts have been in that area. And then more recently, with a kind of an updated twist, kind of revisiting the same territory in 2018 with this other paper, asking a related question: if psilocybin is approved by the FDA for the treatment of a disorder, how should it be scheduled? Right now, it's a Schedule I compound, not allowing any medical use, so that would have to change if the FDA approved, and then what should that schedule be? And more than that, well beyond the scheduling, what should the REMS program look like? And I highly recommend a REMS program. This refers to the risk evaluation mitigation strategies program of the FDA. In other words, what rules can the FDA and should they slap onto the approval of this drug? Sort of like, propofol is clinically approved, but not to take home with you. I mean, that was the problem with Michael Jackson's use. Shouldn't have done that. But yeah, when you're getting an endoscopy, great, approved. So similar to that, is it going to be like the work that colleagues and I have done with administration in the laboratory with various safety mechanisms in place to address the risks? So what are the risks? Don't have time to go into in detail, but folks are probably familiar with, and we know this from clinical observation, is that people that appear to have a predisposition or certainly active psychotic disease, and perhaps related disorders such as bipolar disorder, especially keeping in mind the potential shift in diagnostic categories, what would have been labeled what back in the 1960s. It really appears that a number of folks with predisposition towards a psychotic disorder or mania have been destabilized. And my best assessment of this observational literature is that this can serve the same role as a chaotic life experience, or chaotic life, the same kind of circumstances where someone's lucky to be born to a good family and they've got the predisposition and they're in a good environment, they're kept safe, and they don't have a full-blown reaction, or perhaps the state of their disease is minimized, but someone who's exposed to a traumatic or other intense life experiences can be profoundly destabilized. I think that can certainly happen with these vulnerable individuals. Thankfully, readily, doable to screen to identify those people through structured interviews like a SCID, and screen those people out from intervention. And then the other big risk is the bad trip, is what we call it, challenging experience. I like to call it in the context of this treatment, because if it is in a clinical treatment context, yes, it can be very anxiety provoking, this drug exposure, but the question being, what are the harms that, every once in a while, it's not typical, but it does happen. But people will, they'll be at a concert and they'll freak out and they'll, get hit by a car or something like this, so they're in public or fall from a height, highly intoxicating substance. It shouldn't be a surprise. And I won't, don't have time to go through the others, but those are the two really most prevalent risks to be aware of. Finally, I will mention an area of risk that's typically there for drugs of abuse, and this is a drug of abuse. And certainly depending on its use, it can cause harm. There are definitely risks, and people are sometimes harmed. But it's not a drug of compulsive drug seeking. We know that and this is the whole class of classic psychedelics, the 2A agonists. We know that from reliable animal models of reward self-administration. We know, animals will typically treat these as punishers, avoid them rather than as reinforcers. We know that from large-scale epidemiology, especially if you're mindful to not include MDMA and ketamine, again, not in a different pharmacological class. For the classic psychedelics, the large-scale surveys don't support their addiction potential. And then, the neuroscience, the way they work, or I should say don't work in the mesolimbic dopaminergic reward pathway, like seemingly all of the other potentially addictive drugs of abuse do. There's that difference. So we're pretty solid on that. Just one bit of evidence, probably the best data to try to get psilocybin to function as a reinforcer came from Jim Wood's lab, Bill Fanagrossi et al. Back in 2004 in rhesus monkeys. I'm showing you, self-injections of psilocybin and DMT, both classic psychedelics, falling below the average saline injection level, which is 7 on the y-axis here. On a subset of these are aggregate data here, but in a subset in the same publication, they showed for a few animals, a subset, only for a few sessions, it dipped a little bit above saline. So it looked like there were some transient reinforcing effects, but only when they really bent over backwards, had them on an MDMA baseline training at the beginning, which has some stimulant properties like amphetamine, so it has some addiction potential. And so maybe that served as something of like a fading procedure to have them treat psilocybin temporarily like a reinforcer, but nonetheless, typically they'll avoid it and it'll minimally fall below saline self-injection levels. A part of the safety of these compounds is really what's referred to as the set and setting, or the context, but the mindset of the person and the physical, the environmental context, probably most importantly, the interpersonal context. So this is just a photo of a mock session, a research assistant, just showing you what one of these therapeutic sessions looks like. The person is prepared for the experience in sessions before they get the drug. They get to know the people that will be with them, the guides or the therapist. But they're instructed during the session to trust, let go, be open. They're wearing eye shades, they're listening to music through headphones. And the so-called guides are there really for a supportive role. If the person should have some anxiety, they're there to, as demonstrated here, hold their hand or grab them on the shoulder, remind. Often that physical touch is very helpful, although I think it's very important to be mindful of physical boundaries in this area. And so we limit and warn people, but that's the limit of physical touch. But that's what a session looks like, pleasing, a living room-like environment, trying not, blood pressure machine is kind of tucked under the end table. You can't really see it there, but on purpose, kind of hidden away to make it look as at least kind of like a lab as possible, make it pleasing. I'll shift now into some of the therapeutic work. The first study using this compound psilocybin in cancer patients, picking up on that older work with terminal cancer patients. Not all of these patients in this study were terminal. And oftentimes that's a cloudy designation, and one that in fact thankfully shifts over the years as things become more treatable in some circumstances. But these were 51 patients, all of which had life-threatening cancer. It had either metastasized or it had been at least a year since the initial occurrence, and their psychiatric suffering was still present. So we didn't want to take advantage of some sort of naturalistic resolution. Get a diagnosis, it's really rough for a few weeks or a couple months, but then you process it and you move on, and things are actually pretty okay. We didn't want to take advantage of that naturalistic resolution. But everyone had, and there's no DSM diagnosis yet of end of life anxiety or cancer related distress. Although I would argue it seems like there's a distinct clinical picture here, and I think it will be in the DSM. It should be at one point as that evidence base goes, that it's not the same as garden variety depression or any variety as major depressive disorder or really any type of anxiety disorder, although it has aspects of those. But we predefined a number of potential DSM diagnoses involving either depressive and or anxiety symptoms. And so about a third of our folks have were diagnosable by one of those disorders involving depressive symptoms, about a third a disorder involving anxiety, about a third both depressive and anxiety symptoms. The basic design was a within subject one where everyone was exposed to both the high dose of psilocybin and a lower dose, really a trivial dose that was intended to serve as a control condition or placebo. Really, in this case, so low, not even really intended to fool people in the spirit of an active placebo. Most people probably didn't feel much from it, but more so in this context of this study from the instructional control. You could tell everyone that every session is going to involve psilocybin. One of them will at least be a moderately high dose, but you could have two high doses, a high dose and a low dose, a high dose, a medium dose, a moderately high dose, and a moderate dose. We described a larger subset of possibilities than in reality, which was within that subset that was told people. So it wasn't deception, but what everyone in fact received was they got one high dose session and one low or trivial dose session. And we randomized the order that they received those, and they were separated by 5 weeks. So after this 8 hours of preparation before the first session, we had the dosing session, which with either one of those two doses, and then followed up with assessment of their symptoms 5 weeks after, and then they received whichever dose they didn't receive that first time, and then we assess symptoms 5 weeks later, and then final 6-month follow-up. Saw some large reductions. I'm just going to show you one of our outcomes, but the Hamilton Depression and Anxiety Inventories, these are clinician-administered scales. People came in both randomized group at baseline. This is before randomization, so as one might expect, groups came in virtually identically in terms of their level of suffering. In the clinical range, these numbers in the 20s certainly indicative of some real suffering on these scales. Then at post one, you see in the folks that had been randomized to the high dose group, this is 5 weeks after their high dose session. So in that red group, you see this dramatic reduction at that post one time point for both depression and anxiety. You also saw some sizable reduction in the blue group, that low dose group, probably due to the placebo expectancy response, but also due to 8 hours of preparation before these sessions. And what that involves in part discussion of the person's life, including their cancer, discussion of their worldview. It's a very therapeutic-like environment. And oftentimes for these people, the first time they've had a discussion with a professional that isn't directly about their tumor or their disease state. So, that's probably going on. Nonetheless, statistically distinguishable, and in terms of absolute effect, nowhere near the level of reduction as we saw in the high dose group. Then we get to post two on the x-axis. That's 5 weeks after the second session. So now everyone's had the real deal high dose session, either 5 or 10 weeks before, depending on which group they're in. And now you can see both groups are down to that very low range. And I should have said with the back in describing post one that they're down at this level on the scale where it's on average in the normal range of the scale. It's a dramatic, and for those statistically inclined, these are very large effects in terms of effect size. And that's kind of like, that's cool enough, 5 weeks later that you see this administration causing, this reduction in symptoms, but then we see 6 months later, that's virtually unchanged. That's really exciting, the idea that you could have these persisting effects. Now, before I jump into some more data from that study, I wanted to introduce this concept of the mystical experience, which which sounds pretty woo-woo, but it is a, a validated psychological construct describing a certain type of subjective experience. And interest in it goes back to William James, the father of American psychology. He and other scholars over 100 years ago were just fascinated by the idea that if, even outside of drugs, if you just look at extraordinary human experiences throughout the histories and throughout history and across different cultures in different languages, there's some remarkable similarities. So, and these extraordinary experiences sometimes being prompted by near-death events, sometimes being prompted by meditation or prayer or acoustical techniques, fasting, sometimes out of the blue. But the similarities of these experiences are a sense of unity expressed in different ways, such as feeling at one with the universe or the rest of humanity, positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and ineffability, really the sense that the experience is so compelling it's beyond words. So those as a constellation of effects describe what we call the mystical experience. And so, and we've done some work to further validate some measurements in that area with self-report scales. But what we found in this study was that the degree of reduction of depression and anxiety 6 months after these sessions was statistically related to the degree how mystical the session was as measured on that session day. So before, when the drug wears off, but before they go home with a loved one who drives them home, they complete the scale. And so, and that is interesting enough, but I think it's even more interesting that that relationship holds up after statistically controlling for the participants' rating of drug intensity. So what that seemed to be telling us is that there's something about the nature of that psychological experience, not just sort of getting hit over the head with this like really strong drug effect, but there's something about the nature of what they experience that seems to be predictive of long-term therapeutic response. And so it's not just in our hands. So actually published in the same issue with a slightly different design using niacin rather than low-dose psilocybin as a crossover comparison compound. But colleagues at New York University published very similar results with large reductions in anxiety and depression in cancer patients. They actually published with a subset of participants a very long-term follow-up over 4 years later and found still large reductions in these symptoms. Then moving outside of depression, within cancer, moving into just major depressive disorder, outside of the cancer context, the first work published in that area was by colleagues at Imperial College London, open label, small pilot study, but they found with another depression inventory, reductions that appeared to last potentially up to 3 months. So that was followed up. Our group conducted the first randomized study of psilocybin for major depressive disorder. These 27 folks were sort of entry level randomized study, a waitlist control. So it was open label, but people were randomized to have their 2 psilocybin sessions either immediately after 8 hours of preparation. It took several weeks, but nonetheless, they started that process right away, or they were randomized to wait 8 weeks to start that process. And what we found was that this is a different version of the Hamilton Depression Inventory. Although similar at baseline, we saw statistically large effects, reduction in depression symptoms after each of the 2 symptoms, after the 2 sessions, I should say, and no change in that group that was randomized to just simply wait. And what I'm not showing you here, but after that period, the group that was randomized to wait, they then received 2 psilocybin sessions. And the degree of magnitude in depressive symptom reduction we saw at that point was very similar in magnitude what we saw in the immediate group. And then most recently, back to our colleagues at Imperial College, they published the first double-blind study of psilocybin for major depressive disorder. These are really fun results to dig into. The primary outcome measure for depression, it fell short of statistical significance. It was in comparison to an approved antidepressant, escitalopram, Lexapro. They had other depression measures and other clinical measures, including one showing at the bottom of self-report assessment of well-being that were significant and showed robust effects, but the primary one fell short. Nonetheless, the trend at each of the time points was to fall, to show better improvement for psilocybin compared to escitalopram. Some interesting things about the data, if you notice, like after escitalopram, you see clinical reductions in depression in less than a week, which, as we know, like typically doesn't happen. So I think it's pretty clear what happened here was that sort of therapeutic effect of simply the preparation for the psilocybin and the rapport building, perhaps, and all of that may have in fact been responsible for some of that early, perhaps all of that early response to escitalopram. So there's some mystery there. Nonetheless, I think it's certainly consistent with that this still looks promising for depression, although it fell short of the primary outcome measure for depression. So now I'll move into the addiction work. As I mentioned, it's a cherry on top in studying a potential addiction medication. That the medication itself is not addictive. Certainly not a requirement, given that some of the best treatments we have for addiction are, in terms of agonist treatment, are in fact themselves addictive, and so that can work in the right context. But nonetheless, it appears that these aren't. That's very different than suggesting that they should help with addiction, right? So where's the evidence for that? Well, one area of suggestive evidence is this anthropological literature going back half a century. That's noted a number of addiction recovery stories from people that are embedded into some of these religions that use classic psychedelic containing plants, as I mentioned before. So lots of early anthropological reports of peyote use in the Native American church showing this, and also a number of anthropological reports of addiction recovery after ayahuasca use associated with indigenous religions and syncretic, kind of hybrid indigenous and Christian religions based around ayahuasca use. Now, big caveat is these are all observational. Religious involvement in general can be associated, not surprisingly, with addiction recovery. So take it all with a grain of salt, but suggestive. But adding to that, this early work with LSD and alcoholism, I mentioned this literature. It had been described as a mixed bag until about a decade ago, because there were studies that reported significant effects, other ones reported no effects. Some clarity was brought in a meta-analysis, which I'm showing you here, the individual studies, the 6 individual dots, with the 95% confidence intervals. This is odds ratio. There were only 6 studies that randomized people to either LSD or some other condition for the treatment of alcoholism. They're all here on this figure. Anything to the right of one shows better odds ratio for LSD group. Anything to the left favors the control condition. And so you can see from the confidence interval, some of them, a good number, cross 1. Not surprisingly, a number of these low-end studies failed to show a significant effect in their original publication. All of them tended towards the mean was in the predicted direction of benefiting LSD, and in aggregate, as shown by the diamond at the bottom, a statistically significant effect for sure in aggregate. Much more importantly is the clinical significance of the effect size. I mean, odds ratio of about 2, meaning at the first follow-up, what I'm showing you here, at the first follow-up, folks were about twice as likely to be improved if they were in the LSD condition than if they were in one of the control conditions, which is, those are really good results that are enviable by today's standards in the treatment of AUD. There was also early work suggesting these drugs might help with opioid dependence. So this was a study published in Baltimore in 1973. There were some limitations. The folks in the LSD group had a brief inpatient stay. It was open label, inpatient stay that the other group didn't have. Nonetheless, there were some strengths, kind of atypical for the day. That day, there were a biological verification through urinalysis of opioid use, and they found some substantial differences at 12 months after the treatment favoring the LSD group. So again, despite the limitations, it just, this was the type of thing someone like me would have wanted to have continued throughout, where would we, had there been something to this, it would have been great to know by now. But this is right as things were being put on deep freeze. And so there's a sort of like potential that combined with a bunch of anecdotes. It seems to be this idea that there may be this drugs of abuse anti-addiction potential. In other words, maybe good for treating more the psychological roots that are common across these different forms of addiction. So I kind of tested that in a sense, and tried to use psilocybin to help people quit tobacco smoking. Number of reasons. It's a very quantifiable a form of addiction, and something I had lots of experience going back with to graduate school. So small pilot study, open label study that I started with a small amount of funding to be able to look at. Kind of the important things here are, in these 15 people, they had been smoking on average over 30 years, multiple quit attempts, smoked about a pack a day. These were not lightweights. It was a 15-week protocol with weekly meetings. We use cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the typical talk therapy to help people quit smoking, not during psilocybin sessions, but in the preparatory sessions beforehand, the 4 sessions before they actually, as they prepare, before they have the psilocybin, the first psilocybin session. And in the other the follow-up sessions, this is stuff like keeping a smoking diary before you quit, assigning a target quit date, how to handle it if you slip and found you've smoked one, how not to let that turn into a full-blown relapse. And there were 3 psilocybin sessions over an 8-week period, starting with a moderate and then moving to a higher dose. And the first psilocybin session was on their target quit date, signed several weeks ahead of time. So this is a big day for people. They're going to quit smoking, big deal by itself, and they're going to have this really large dose guided psilocybin session. These, we did 2 biological metrics, both urine cotinine and exhaled breath carbon monoxide. I'll show you the carbon monoxide results. This is before the first psilocybin session. This is the median values after. Clearly, there's a pre-post difference. Don't need to run a lot of stats to show that. Another way to look at the data are point prevalence absence. So this is at each time point by both self-report and both of the biological metrics I mentioned. Do they all agree that the person has not smoked in the last 7 days? That rate at 6 months was 80%, and that held up at a very long-term follow-up that we added at 2.5 years or 30 months, that was 60%. So those are very high numbers for point prevalence absence. It's an open label pilot, so really the only question we can ask is this worthy of follow-up? But the answer appeared to be yes. Another way to look at the data is continuous abstinence. This is the most stringent measure. So this is meaning by self-report and all of the both biological metrics, that all the evidence suggests that they have not had a single puff since their target quit date. And our numbers were over 50%, which is very, as I'm showing on the right most column. Now take it with a grain of salt. I only want to show you like why we thought the data were promising to move forward for a more rigorous study. So I'm drawing these other values from the best values I could find that were representative of what you get for these, was typically in the literature. But nonetheless, in terms of absolute success rate, the best medication we have, varenicline, substantially less success on average. So again, it seemed like we were onto something worthy of follow-up. Following that thread with mystical experience, this type of subjective effect during the session, we, like the cancer study, we found that mystical experience was predictive of long-term smoking success in this small sample. So all of that kind of set us up to move into this currently running study, a randomized comparative study. This study is not double-blind. That's the next in line. I really wanted for myself to see whether we're really onto something here. I thought the next step was, hey, there are a bunch of questions around how do you optimally bind these psychedelics. I thought, I really want to see some data on the way we would treat a novel psychotherapy where blinding isn't possible. Hey, randomize people that are willing to do both, compare it versus sort of a known gold standard, or a known standard, I should say. So we're comparing it to nicotine patch. Definitely works better than placebo. dozens and dozens of studies have shown that, but plenty of room for improvement. The same cognitive behavioral therapy outside of those psilocybin sessions. We scale back to one session, not that I think that's the optimal number, but more for experimental reasons because we're doing pre and post fMRI to look at correlates of success, and it kind of muddied the waters to have multiple psilocybin sessions. But like the pilot, these were not lightweights. They smoked about 16, 17 cigarettes a day, had been smoking over 25 years on average. So this is in the context of an open label comparative efficacy study. I can show you where we're at without taking a statistical hit on where we're at right now with the 61 people. So the majority that have gone to their 1 year follow-up, 31 people in psilocybin, 30 in patch. So the psilocybin group, 52% of people at 12 months are biologically confirmed as quit. That's comparing to 27% for nicotine patch or nicotine replacement therapy, NRT. I just mean the patch by that. So clearly it can change. These are not the final results. It's in process, but at this snapshot, things are looking promising. It's roughly doubling the success rates. And I should say 27% is doing very well at 1 year for nicotine patch. That's sort of towards the upper end of what you would expect to get, especially at 1 year. So I'm proud of that, but I had to still keep our eye on the ball. There's a number of things directions that we think we've explored in the study, potential mechanisms that we'll hopefully explore more in future work. So an early signal that we had in analyzing some of our cognitive data associated with the fMRI imaging, we found that on the MSIT task, multi-source interference task, it's a test of cognitive control. It's how it's usually described. Sometimes called the oddball task, where you have to identify a particular digit, the one where there's a single digit, the oddball. So if there's a single one and 2 zeros, one's the oddball. The tough thing is you're instructed to use the finger number that corresponds to that actual digit you're identifying. And everyone's tendency is to use the finger that's in the same spatial location. Some trials, those two things are not inconsistent. They're the same thing. Other trials, the interference trials on the right, there's a discrepancy. And so it's like a Stroop task where there's this prepotent response you've got to resist, and it's really tough to do. And so that's the measure of cognitive control. The difference between these congruent and incongruent trials, which is called an interference score. We did find that psilocybin showed a substantial and significant improvement comparing their screening data to the day after they quit smoking with psilocybin that we didn't see in the nicotine patch group. And I should say onboard nicotine was controlled for the people actually, and the patch group hadn't slapped the patch on yet for that reason. So perhaps there's something good. Perhaps this is sometimes people seem to say they're less prone to the automaticity, reaching the hand in the pack for the cigarette or driving into the store sort of on autopilot. Perhaps this is a behavioral measure that's picking up on those kind of anecdotes sometimes people share. I'll go a little more quickly here through my slides, but I've published based on kind of those laboratory data. I've heard more and more stories of people saying, oh, they took this stuff for fun years ago and like they quit smoking or they quit drinking or they quit using cocaine or opioids. So I've published a number of studies that have collected those stories. And, you can't test efficacy with this type of design, but to really see if we can learn something about the landscape. And one of the things in that spirit that's popped out is this work where we collected these stories of people using psychedelics, and they said they either quit or reduced smoking because of it. We found this sort of pop out effect if you kind of give them a laundry list of withdrawal symptoms and say on a Likert scale, compare this to other times you've quit smoking or tried to quit smoking if you've done that. And it's interesting for the more somatic symptoms, the modal response was, yeah, that's about the same as other times I've quit smoking. But when you get down to the affective symptoms, anxiety, restlessness, depression, low mood, irritability, craving, the modal response is not only less severe, but much less severe. That's interesting given the data I showed you on depression, both in MDD and cancer. So affective processing, is that a commonality? One of the commonalities transdiagnostically. So very fortunate that we were able to convince NIDA that this was worthy of pursuit. So we now have funding that we're It's with the FDA now, with the IND and with the IRB, but to move into this multi-site trial, double-blind, using psilocybin for smoking cessation. Other sites being New York University and University of Alabama, Birmingham. So looking forward to getting some results and starting that study. I'll tell you that a very similar trajectory has been followed by my good colleague Mike Bogenschutz, who's actually the lead of the NYU site I mentioned of our new UO1 NIDA study. But he's been on this line of research using psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorder. Started with a small open label pilot, 2 psilocybin sessions, saw large reductions in drinking days, as I'm showing you here quickly on the slide. He's now recently completed a 100-person randomized study, anxiously awaiting those results any day now. So really, really looking forward to seeing those results when they're published. So I'll mention upcoming studies, continuing this work. I mentioned the multi-site research for smoking cessation. But another area of research interest of mine as this work expands is PTSD. So I have a study that's about to start using psilocybin to treat PTSD. Also, I have some research, a study about to start in treating opioid dependence in the context of methadone maintenance with people still struggling with illicit opioid use. And also some work, again, all of these have now been FDA approved, or at least the PTSD and the opioid use and the LSD study for chronic pain. Those have been approved by the FDA, so preparing to actually start that work. It would be exciting to eventually get going with that LSD work, because it's still the compound that was used by far more in the earlier era than psilocybin. A lot of safety data on it. It's a long-acting compound, might make things a little tougher clinically, but there's some really early promising data using LSD to treat pain in cancer patients. So this is going to be in the context of non-cancer pain. But to explore a little bit more this interest in PTSD, one of the threads of why we'd expected an effect there for psilocybin is this related drug. I mentioned MDMA, the serotonin releaser, different mechanism, but there are some substantial overlaps. I mean, this is psychedelic therapy. The real paradigm shifting model is like, right, typical psychiatric medication. You take it once a day or with some frequency, and it reduces symptoms when it's on board. Or you take a PRN, you get anxious, you take the benzo, reduces anxiety. These are treatments where you have 1, 2, or 3 prepared sessions, and then we're seeing these clinical improvements months or even a year later. That's different. What's going on there? That same exact pattern is happening with this work with MDMA, which is actually at the most advanced stage. It's work that some close colleagues have done. And one phase 3 study has been published in the treatment of PTSD with some pretty impressive effects that have held up, very consistent with the earlier phase 2 data. A lot of folks anecdotally are saying a lot of vets are going down to Peru and doing ayahuasca and doing mushrooms. So, either psilocybin or other drugs like ayahuasca, which has DMT, which is a classic psychedelic, certainly more similar to psilocybin, can say, compared to MDMA, but a lot of anecdotes and even, I try to collect information where I can, keep it at arm's length, but even there's underground therapists that have been doing work with these compounds for decades, and plenty of those types of folks will say that MDMA is sort of entry level, but when it works, wow, you can really get even better results with these classic psychedelics. So that's anecdote, but that's part of the rationale for looking at psilocybin and PTSD treatment. And recent news, and this is really great to hear, just like locally, that it's now going to be move into law, and the governor said he's without signing, but he's going to let it move forward. This fund by the state of Maryland. I testified back in March at the Senate Appropriations Committee in support of this, but a fund to support research into novel treatments, including psychedelics and some other, and a couple of other treatments in Maryland for the treatment of PTSD in veterans. So I think that's good kind of local news and very promising to move forward in this area. But the big questions in this area that surely need to pop up for people, either this is snake oil, In other words, and I refer to back before the FDA, and you can make any claim in the world. Oh, this stuff works for this elixir works for everything that ails you. Okay, it's not going to be that. We're going to hit boundary conditions. I'm sure. Nonetheless, for what we've seen so far, it really is quite astonishing that we're seeing potentially efficacious treatments with these like nominally distinct disorders, not only different forms of substance use disorders, but then they're into that affective disorder. So we're talking about depression and anxiety and cancer, depression and major depressive disorder. What's going on here? I really think the key, I mentioned a few, affective processing, cognitive control, ideas to explore more in the future. But these type of what's going on? What are the commonalities between these disorders? And I really feel that psychedelics in the long term can be a tool, much in the spirit of RDoC, with NIMH, realizing, hey, compared to other areas of medicine, psychiatry is like largely descriptive. It's not, our categories are not based on a mechanistic understanding, unfortunately. We need to think more about what are the transdiagnostic processes. I think psychedelics may be a powerful tool, and we need to be answering the questions, what's connecting the dots between these nominally distinct disorders? So in that sense, indirectly, psychedelics can be a good tool just for advancing psychiatry in terms of the potentially understanding, providing more information in the spirit of RDoC that about the nature, connecting these nominally distinct disorders. And I should say, I've come, and particularly from doing a lot of these sessions in the room as a guide and just supervising these sessions and talking to hundreds of participants, I really am starting to view all of this as addiction broadly defined. My real basis is as a drug abuse addiction researcher, psychopharmacology, but rather than depression. But nonetheless, I view all of these disorders, particularly from what I've seen with psychedelics, as a narrowed behavioral, including mental repertoire. And whether that narrowed repertoire is the repeated use of a substance despite harm, or the repeated way of thinking about yourself and framing of yourself in the world, with all kinds of behavioral ramifications, isolation, et cetera, and depression. I think psychedelics, that may be a way to think about this that kind of hits me at the gut in terms of like what's really going on here. And somehow we have a whole lot to fill in, but when these sessions work, just to put it simply, it seems like people can be temporarily blasted out of these local minima, like these suboptimal ruts that people are in. And in a clinical context where that kind of shift is reinforced, a new normal can be reestablished in this period of perhaps enhanced learning that might be suggested by some of the rodent research showing different forms of neuroplasticity prompted by these compounds. So there's a whole lot to explore. In so many domains to fully understand the therapeutics of these things. But we need to look at different compounds, different disorders with narrowed repertoires, a whole lot to figure out about what the heck do we do during psychedelic therapy. We use the same methods that were proposed in the 1950s. Seems to work pretty good. I published a small paper recently, just switching up the music program. We got slightly better results than kind of this traditional classical music. We need to do a whole lot more randomized work to switch up how can we optimize therapy, this thing called integration. Is that the neuroplasticity unfolding after the sessions in humans? We need to figure that out. And last thing I'll say is that we just, in this area, I do have some serious concerns about how this work is being done. I put out this piece a couple of years ago that I got a lot of thanks for, but also some really direct criticism, including a number of close colleagues that, people often go into have these sessions and they come out with some sort of story to tell about the nature of them. Was it perceived as religious, spiritual? That can mean many things to many different people, spanning the supernatural to just, healthy, secular, optimal human thriving. And you run across the metaphysical all the time and what people think of these sessions. I think it's absolutely critical that we let the patients drive the bus on any of those interpretations. And this is not what I see what's happening in the field. People set up rooms that look like New Age retreat centers. No offense to that. But with Buddhas and whatnot, what about the Muslims showing up? What about the atheists, the fundamentalist Christians that might say, like, that's not for me? I think researchers and clinicians, I have no doubt that clinicians, that we're going to see cult-like behavior, all of the abuses, like sexual boundaries. It's critical in this area. I know that this work can be done safely, but it's really going to be critical that people are aware of the power. It's very hard to be associated with what is sometimes the most meaningful session in someone's experience in someone's life as a clinical intervention. And that comes with a whole lot of responsibility and weight that can be abused. So those are the types of things I'm looking at, and I hope to do, work to try to help the field stay on the right course and avoid some of those issues. So with that, I'll wrap it up and just thank a whole lot of colleagues and over the years nonprofit funding organizations that have made this work possible. But thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So really some thought-provoking ideas, lots of questions that you asked, lots of things to follow up on. There's a number of questions in the chat, so why don't we try to get through some of these. Rob White states after 6 months, both the high and the low dose are the same as far as results. You pointed out actually that the low dose was like placebo, but both were effective. Doesn't that point to the effect of the environment and treatment other than the drug?
So with those data in the cancer study, the 6-month follow-up was after the crossover. So those two, the most powerful data and the most rigorous data are comparing those first two, the 5 weeks after each of those two sessions. What you get at the 6-month follow-up, I mean, the idea is, and all the evidence is consistent with this, that, this is, thankfully seems to be a persisting type of effects. In other words, the clinical improvement we saw for the high dose group that had the high dose, they had it right away. It's not like they went up after, then they got the low dose group. They didn't after they got the low dose 5 weeks later. It's not like that negated the effect. So essentially, if it's a non-reversible effect, apparently, that may be what we're seeing at 6 months. So 6 months is after that crossover of the two blinded conditions. So that's not as strong as evidence of comparing. So that as comparing those two first time points, because it could be that the 6 month was just completely driven by the high dose. Now, theoretically, could that have been driven by the low dose? Theoretically too, but we don't know.
So the next question is related. The question is, was the study that you compared high and low doses placebo controlled?
Yeah, in that cancer study, we had you could consider it an active placebo, but it was 1 milligram. And there was a little bit of nuance there. For the first couple of people, we'd use 3 milligrams, and we actually made a slight change to both the low dose and the high dose based on the first couple of participants. In the end, we looked at the data and the data did not look different. So we presented them aggregate, but for most people, it was 1 milligram was the low dose, which is not a true placebo. And we didn't have a true placebo in that study. So again, that was meant more to serve as a instructional control, so we can truthfully tell people that you were going to get some dose of psilocybin in every session.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gorelick asks, are the psychedelics, they're Schedule 1? What is your source for human studies?
Yeah, so they're Schedule 1, and now, gosh, there's dozens of manufacturers for psilocybin at this point, given the industry interest. Traditionally, our older studies, and actually the stuff that's been published to date, before there was the industry interest and people were thinking, wow, we could actually eventually put this into patients. That came from a good colleague in the air, a chemist, retired now, but spent most of his career at Purdue, Dave Nichols. And we got it approved, so pure psilocybin synthesized, identical to what's in the mushrooms, but not extracted from mushrooms, but synthetic psilocybin. Now, more recently, we've been getting it from different entities such as the USONA Institute, which is a nonprofit, which is in phase 2B trials for psilocybin for depression. Some upcoming smoking cessation work, and I'm using a product from a company called Midocin, who's working to bring it to patients for smoking cessation. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you for that. Next question, Jessica Gore, how much molecular research is happening or is there still to do in the function and effects of classic psychedelics? For example, is there any potential effect of psilocybin on the tumor itself in these end-of-life anxiety studies?
I think I might have missed some of that. I'm sorry. What was the
So
last
the question
part?
is around how much molecular research is happening or still needs to do. For example, is there any potential effect of psilocybin on the tumor itself in these end-of-life
Right.
anxiety studies?
So there is no evidence that I'm aware of that would suggest an effect on tumors, but there none of the research on helping cancer patients has been proposed as actually affecting the disease state itself. This is speculative, but given what we know about the effects of psychosomatic process and how and actually in research shows in cancer diagnosis, like one psychological orientation could affect disease progression. I would think for an effect like that, you would need a very like hundreds of people to show it. If it's indirect through simply improving quality of life and reducing the depression, like you might improve the underlying disease state. So, but I wouldn't know of any hypotheses for directly affecting tumor growth. And that, I mean, there's a whole lot of molecular work going on in the area, but none focused on that more at the psychiatric level in terms
Okay.
of
All right.
Yeah.
Next question is the depression data. What is the longest outcome time point measured?
Well, depends on how you count it. So I mentioned earlier, the NYU group had a 4 to 5 year time point follow up. However, like I just discussed with our 6-month follow up, that's long past any crossover of the blinded condition. So you have to put that in a different bin in terms of evaluating it. I mean, that could be completely driven by there's no potential even control. They knew they were in a psilocybin study at that point, and there's that one of those conditions, they got strong dose of psilocybin. So, but yeah, it's been looked at over 4 years later, and looks good with all those limitations applying.
Okay. There's research showing that psychedelics can induce neuroplasticity, I believe. Could these compounds potentially be used towards developmental disorders for traumatic brain injury recovery?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of interest in that. In fact, I've been trying to hustle up from some funding in that area, and actually the sports organization, the UFC, the mixed martial arts organization, they flew me and colleagues out to their headquarters. They were really interested in this area. They kept getting reports from athletes, including retired athletes, that say they've really been, including like memory and cognitive issues that come from repetitive head impact, that they thought that this was really helpful for them. So I'm hopeful that to do some work in that category, and in doing some of the work, the exciting thing would be is like this almost universally comes with at least depression and substance use disorders like so frequently. And so, and since based on, the non-human neuroplasticity, that's a little more, that and human anecdotes, a little more speculative, but can we treat the depression? Hey, need to do the empirical work, but in the scheme of things, I think that's a pretty good bet, given that we keep seeing depression, effects on depression in different populations. And then as a cherry on top, if you actually got some sort of, straight up, neurological repair, in more of a direct fashion, and then with related improvements on executive function, memory, and these types of things, like, wow. And then that all obviously would set you up for, oh gosh, can it be used for stroke and any number of,
right,
neurological type disorders.
Okay. Next question. Do you think that MDMA can be used in combination with existing evidence-based practices for PTSD, such as CPT, PE, or EMDR? Do you have any plans to study this?
Yeah, so some of that, thankfully, some colleagues in the field are are doing that. I believe right now, nothing's published, but I believe Esther Rothblum is doing stuff with the MAPS, the group that's funded a lot of the MDMA work in terms of actually using cognitive processing therapy in conjunction with MDMA therapy. Theoretically, what MDMA may be doing, even without that explicit, marriage with prolonged exposure or cognitive processing, the idea is that it's doing the same type of thing, that it is, you're pulling up the memory, you're able to work with these memories somehow with, a dampened amygdala response and the other changed context, that you're able to work with these memories from this very different perspective, and that's reconsolidated in that state. So very consistent with what is the explicit aim in these various, exposure therapies like PE or CPT. But gosh, I just wrote a paper with a good colleague, David Yaden, on just like encouraging more use of CBT and other empirically based models within psychedelic therapy. So yes, if we're treating PTSD, what works really well if they do the treatment, what works better than anything else? Those treatments. Let's combine it with that. So try to get the best results. So yeah, I think, looking forward to some of those results.
Next question, you referred earlier to psychedelic retreats and folks using hallucinogens under the supervision of individuals who may not have clinical training, though might use the title of shaman or healer. Should this concern the clinical community?
Yeah, I think at any number of levels, like I've had so many clinicians in this area that say, and probably some people on this call and say like, yeah, their patients are reaching out and saying, what about this stuff? Should I do it? Should I go down to South America? Should I go to this thing my friends invited me to or whatever? And, gosh, this is like, I do encourage folks in that category. Even if one doesn't, one should not encourage, illicit use or use under conditions where there's not a real knowledge of that safety factors are going to be there. Nonetheless, in the spirit of harm reduction, to inform that, hey, I'm not telling you to do this, but if you do it, you should really be sure that you know what you're taking and you're with people you trust. And all of these things that, that we do know what kind of separates the safest from the riskiest versus relative, like less risky use, not that any of it is safe. But it should be of concern to, like, one, how we hold the science. Like when we see, like, and there's a law in Oregon that everyone's watching. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It needs to be done right. But I think as part of kind of sending the right signal, part of they might have changed in the modern evolution of it, but at least an earlier draft was, we're not going to one doesn't need, educational requirements to be a clinician, to do this as a guide, because out of respect for indigenous cultures that have been doing this. And, I get that level of respect. Nonetheless, if you're treating a disorder, we call that the practice of medicine, and nothing else puts it in the same, so I think we need to be paying attention. Things will happen out there where something horrific happens. Someone freaks out and they really get harmed. And then we have to look, and it's going to be front page news. And we're going to say, okay, how do we evaluate that evidence in the light of this trajectory of these FDA trials? Were they doing it under the conditions? Like, we know there are risks. And so that's one of the biggest concerns, is the potential conflation by not only the public, but even folks in the field, like fellow, psychiatrists and psychologists that aren't specialized in the area, thinking, oh, wow, it turns out that stuff wasn't so safe after all. So yeah, that's one of my big concerns.
If I could just throw in here, I mean, it calls up the article about a month ago out of Canada of a study that went awry and went viral with video of the therapist spooning the patient in the bed during what appeared to be a negative experience. I mean, it was just awful.
Yeah, watching that was just so difficult, and it should just, like, for any clinician, I mean, I'm an experimental PhD on a clinic, but it's for any human being that, like, it's horrific. And you look and, like, how in the world did we end up here? And right. Frankly, part of that backdrop is this kind of the loose boundaries that, for better, were part of those societal changes when these drugs were first introduced, and some of those folks that, yeah,
Right.
So it's a big
So-
concern.
Yeah, it really is. So we have just a couple more questions and just a couple more minutes. So let's see if we can answer the rest of them. Dan Roche asks, there we go. Any thoughts on effectiveness or lack thereof of placebos in controlling the expectancy effects of the hallucinogen response?
Yeah, we need to do a better job, and we need to start with like reporting on the credibility of our placebos. So I have a paper submitted reviewing all of the blinding conditions throughout the history of psychedelic research. And that's one of our biggest take homes. And I call myself out as much as anybody. We need to do it in terms of what I've held. We need to assess the credibility of the blinds that we use and start there. There's issues with the blind across a lot of areas of medicine, but I want to do some explicit research on testing a variety of other active placebos to inform future science, like what is the best way to do this. So I think there's a whole lot of work we can do better in that domain.
So I guess I skipped the question but it's kind of similar. Thank you. Could you address the problem of afterglow effects of psychoactive compounds? Is this confounding?
Is
this confounding?
That the afterglow is disconfounding.
Yeah, the afterglow effects of the psychoactive compounds is it confounding to the results? Yeah,
or it might be an inherent part of the efficacy. So I mean, I think we certainly need to keep this. And for folks that don't know this, it's this very loose kind of description of a lot of times after psychedelic, people say even though the drug's worn off, they feel kind of reset for a few days, or they still feel like there's this clarity that's there, that they have more agency, but there really isn't any real experimental work behind it. It may be that some of the unfolding neuroplasticity in the field that we're seeing in rodents, that might be mediating this, but we really know nothing about it. Experimentally, I'd say, yeah, it's like you can't have a session the next day, and that certainly would be, if you have the other comparison condition the next day, you'd be right. One, you may not have done enough half-lives to make sure it's all metabolized, but yeah, you might be in the afterglow of the previous experience, so you need to account for that.
There is one question a little bit. Do you mind if we email you more questions? There seems to be a lot more questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. A more complicated question perhaps is how does this work? Or just curious to know about the signaling mechanism of psilocybin.
So the signaling mechanism in terms of receptor pharmacology.
Let's see if the data is still on.
So we know, that there's psilocybin and the other active, classic psychedelics are 2A agonists. We know that serotonin and some other experimental compounds like bromo LSD and lysergide are 2A agonists that don't lead to the same pathway of post-receptor signaling that seems to differentiate the psychedelic compounds to the other 2A agonists, including serotonin. That seems to leads to these downstream effects on glutamate, which might be part of the reason why these NMDA antagonist drugs like ketamine, there does seem to be some overlap and perhaps shared therapeutic efficacy. As we know, ketamine can help with depression. So I'm not sure if that was completely off base in terms of what the person's question that they're going for, but.
Does that answer your question, Aditi? Do you want to unmute? Is that good? Okay, good. And one last question, and we're down to the last final few minutes. Thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if any brain state comparisons have been made between mystical experiences occurring under the influence of psychedelics versus non-clinical hallucinators, example, psychics, shamans, eliciting such experiences without any substance.
I've been involved with colleagues, some survey research, making those comparisons, but in terms of really the digging in and comparing these, so with anything sort of biological during the experiences, no. There's some interesting connections I don't know, we published some work on with people adopting a meditation practice, and we have a data set that hasn't been published yet, but assessing these psilocybin effects in long-term meditators. Kind of a take home from that latter study is that, I mean, the problem with these other techniques is it's so you can't, even with someone with 10,000 hours of experience, you can't say, have a powerful transcendental experience, start now. You know, they're not, and that's one of the great things about the psychedelic compounds. They're like reliable, like something interesting is going to happen. You could spend years meditating. And so I think for that reason, because of that lack of reliability, and that's why it's been talked about that if you're interested in these, call them what you will, these mystical transcendental states, that just as an experimental tool, the psychedelics are great because these other ways to get at them are just so, you know, they're more accessible maybe on a regular basis, but they don't come with the the reliability and the intensity that
Right.
can be had with psychedelics. That limits the science.
Okay, well, that was our last question, and we finished just in time, so that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for a great presentation, very thought-provoking. Wish you well in your future ongoing research.
Thank you. Happy to take any questions by email. Appreciate it.